We're going where you want to go so you can be where you need to be. It's Road Gang Radio with Lindsay Lawler and Jimmy Mack on RadioNemo.com.
One of our favorite segments that made the move with us onto this new platform, go to allthingsliberty.com. All Things Liberty is the place where you should be because that is where you can find out about the Journal of the American Revolution and this segment, Revolution Road. Nancy Rubin Stuart, and by the way, if you just write that name out in full, Nancy Rubin Stuart, and that's spelled like you were from Scotland, STUART.com, is a place you should go because you'd find out about an amazing author and scholar whose books include Poor Richard's Women, Defiant Brides, The Muse of the Revolution, and the national bestseller, American Empress. As a journalist, Nancy's writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, the Washington Post, the New England Quarterly, and other periodicals. She's the executive director of the Cape Cod Writers Center. I wonder if Lindsay's husband has ever crossed paths with her. They are Cape Cod people as well. She's a columnist for the Saturday Evening Post and president of the Mercy Otis Warren Society. And by the way, she would be perfect on this show in so many ways and not just Revolution Road. Nancy, good morning and welcome to Road Gang Radio, Revolution Road.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Women in the Revolution. I mean, you know, it's one of those things too. We're not talking. we're not just talking about. And I'm gonna let you kind of hold court here. But we're not just talking about, you know, the ladies who kind of whispered in the ear of the important men. We're talking about people in the action. We're talking about, you know, people who actually got down and dirty and were part of basically tipping the scales in favor of the course of liberty and freedom and and what would become the Constitution and what would become the United States. I'm not going to ask you how you got interested in this topic. It's a stupid question. The question is, who was the first person when you began to study this area that really stopped you in your tracks and said, I have got to learn more about her?
Well, the first person was Deborah Reed. That's Franklin's wife. And I was fascinated because, you know, up until he became involved in the revolution, he was a public figure with all his newspaper work and all of his inventions. But once he became involved in the revolution, she really had to pick up the rein and take care of everything at home. And when people started to stampede and protest the Stamp Act and somehow mistakenly thought, you know, Franklin was for that, they were about to, you know, storm her house, and she defended the house actually with a shotgun. I mean, incredible. So, yeah, she was a really feisty character. And then when people would attack him, because he, of course, was in London, and he was trying to make peace with the Parliament. You know, all these crazy rumors were coming back. She kept defending him. So that was the earliest of the women. But after that, the one who really got my attention even more was Mercy Otis Warren, who lived in Plymouth, Massachusetts. And she was a wealthy, highly educated, very unusual that she was highly educated, which was because her father favored her, so she could sit in on her brother's preparation for Harvard. So she was very highly educated, and she started to write these, well, they're like Saturday Night Live, but in print, farces about Governor Hutchison and all the terrible things that were going on here in Massachusetts and all of the occupation by the British and all of the writs of assistance and then, you know, all the various, you know, things that happened, the occupation by soldiers in Boston. And she started to write these farces, which were published all over the place and put in pamphlets in all the newspapers. But of course, the women weren't supposed to be in politics. Women weren't supposed to be even thinking about politics. They're supposed to be hearth and home. And she couldn't have her byline on these things. So they really sparked the most incendiary of her satirical plays. Was right before the actual sort of breakout of the Revolution of Bloodshed at Lexington and Concord. So she really fascinated me. You know, and she went on later. You know, she was instrumental in many things women did. Women didn't just, you know, whisper in the ears of their guys, or the guys whisper in the ears of their women about the revolution. Many women at that time deliberately boycotted British clothes, British tea. They made homespun, out of wool and flax here in this country. They drank the local sassafras tea or mint tea, whatever you could do. They weren't drinking English tea. They held spinning bees. They involved in a lot of boycotts, and they spread boycotts around to their friends. So even the ordinary woman was very much involved. And there's a wonderful story when the soldiers were going to Lexington and Concord and retreating, the British I'm talking now, that the women were throwing on their rooftops, were throwing hot water and boiling oil on these soldiers. So they were pretty active. But Mercy Otis Warren in particular was, sort of a spokesperson for it. And then later, John Adams, who was a friend of hers and kept agitating that she write more, she eventually collected so many materials over a period of 25 years during the Revolution and after the Revolution. And she finally wrote a history of the Revolution called The Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. So which didn't even come out until 1805 because, for various political reasons, she and John Adams, who was at one point president, had quarrels about the kind of government we should have here in America. So she was a really feisty, unusual character. And because she was a writer and because she was literary and because she could keep records, I mean, many women didn't even read, much or certainly not write much. She was one of the first ones who did.
This is interesting because I have an insight that I'd like to bounce off of you, and then I have a legit question about Warren in a moment here. The first is, America, in many ways becomes we talk about the idea of the states these days being the great laboratories of democracy. In many ways, you could say, and Franklin is a great example, that the United States of America is maybe the first great mad scientist lab of the world. That you have groups of independent thinkers, men and women, in their workshops, in essentially what is the colonial equivalent of a garage, tinkering in ways to make the world anew. And this may be the first country, and you've just given us an example of it with Franklin's wife, with Elizabeth Reed, of the first country in human history not only to have its constitution for the people, but to actually have women on porches with shotguns. And I'm not being glib about that. There's something kind of magnificent about that it's like, look, we're out here in the wilderness. We are not part of the British Empire in the sense that we're not on the terra firma of Great Britain. We got to kind of make do. And I can't hold to kind of old mores if I've got to go into Boston and leave my wife on the farm. She better know how to use a gun, and she better know how to get people off the damn front porch. That I got to tell you, man, a woman on a porch with a shotgun is an empowering thing. That's a reality. And in many ways, the geography and the circumstances and the distance from the structure of the British Empire really allows people to experiment not just with machinery or forms of government, but their very identities. I mean, we're talking about colonial space where women can become. And I'm kind of curious to get your thoughts on that. Once you touch on that, can you, for our listeners, explain Warren's problems with Adams in regards to the type of government we should have? Because I think it really informs a lot of the different threads of thinking about what kind of country we would have while the revolution was going on. Did any of that make sense, by the way?
Yeah, and you've asked a couple of questions. I just want to say right in the beginning that the American idea of speaking for yourself and speaking up and not being cowed by old traditions, that's very American. I mean, that's what makes the frontier. That's what made pioneer women. That's what, eventually settled this whole country into becoming a continent. It's that, American ingenuity, American independence, American spirit. Again, we're far away from the old country and the old rituals that had even dominated the colonial era here in America. As far as Adams and Mercy Warren, let me just say it's the Federalists versus the Anti-Federalists. And that's still an argument that's going on today. I mean, states' rights versus, national, rights. So that argument continues, and that's the argument that actually split the early patriots, the Warrens and others, from John Adams. Of course, Jefferson comes in later. He returns much more to that concept. But it's an old argument, and it continues. That tension today, we see it in everything.
Okay, so let's talk about those tensions, by the way, because the politics of the revolution creates dissension inside of families themselves. to the point where we are now in a world where, over in England, it's like, well, I support the king. Well, I don't. That's not an argument people have in their homes in England. This is something kind of new as well, too. And women would fall on all sides of the issue here as well. I mean, some, being incredibly timid about wanting to hold on to what had been built and not jeopardize that. Some knowing that they couldn't hold on to that stuff if, in fact, they didn't start taking some chances. I mean, in many ways, the mentality of a small business owner is really what's at play all across the colonial landscape. So I was kind of curious about how inside of people's homes these arguments played out for women, how they were kind of going at, both their husbands, their children, their fathers, their mothers. What kind of arguments were happening in the colonial homes, and what role did women play in that, in determining not only what the purpose of the revolution was, but should there be one at all?
Well, of course, we don't know because, as I said to you earlier, very few women could do more than write in a very early, third, fourth grade manner. They never went beyond the dame schools if they did that at all. So we don't have a lot of records. Let me just say about historians think somewhere around 35 to 40% of this country was not for the revolution. So, we think when we learn this stuff in school, everybody was for the revolution. No, not everybody was. So we never know. And also, women were supposed to be in hearth and home. And goodness, they had so much to do just to get through every single day. I mean, everything we do is automated today. We think about laundry and cooking and prepared meals and news and medicines. They didn't have that stuff. And the medicines, of course, were herbals. So, and a lot of it was folklore that was passed on. So everything was extremely difficult for a woman to maintain and care for her family. Therefore, women were supposed to be in hearth and home and not involved in the world of events. So, but I'm sure that there had to be some disagreement between people on this matter. Although, again, women were really held back from that. So, but there were families that were just as, by the way, later in the Civil War, families were divided by this. And I'm sure that there were people on either side. However, the Americans, the colonists in rebelling against Britain, this soon became, a national, at least the 13 colonies all banded together and cooperated on everything. So finally, in one voice, even though there were 13 different voices and had 13 different, which is why it took more than 4 months in the summer of 1787 to create a constitution. Let's many differences there, between the regions. Yeah.
Let me talk about a couple of names here. I'm gonna throw two more names at you. We've talked a little bit about Mercy Otis Warren, and we've talked about Deborah Reed Franklin. Lucy Flucker Knox and Peggy Shippen Arnold. Can we kind of talk about both of them to give? And like I said, those are names that a lot of our listeners don't know. I'm familiar with them, but I would love you to kind of unpack both of them.
Sure. Well, Lucy Flucker she came from a wealthy Tory family. Her father was the provincial crown-appointed secretary of Massachusetts, wealthy family, and she fell in love with poor bookbinder Henry Knox, who was a patriot. He was a revolutionary, and she married him. The title of my book, Defiant Brides, is just about that. So she not only marries him, but when the revolution breaks out, she never sees her family again. She's married to him, and Lucy follows Henry Knox through many of the revolutionary war camps. She bears many children, and many of them die. Some of them because of diseases that broke out, smallpox and other things in the camps. And she's a faithful patriot. And the book is about two women. One, they're both Defiant Brides. Peggy Shippen's she's a belle of Philadelphia. She's from a wealthy family in Philadelphia. And both of these women defy their families and marry these men. They're both 18. And fortunately, we had writings from both of them. So, my question in my book was, one bride becomes a patriot, which is Lucy Flucker Knox, and the other one becomes a spy, which is Peggy Shippen, who marries, guess who? Benedict Arnold. And when she married Benedict Arnold, he was a war hero. He came to Philadelphia as a war hero. He was the commandant because he was crippled from an earlier battle in the Revolution. She marries him. He's a high position And yet, soon afterwards, because he's disappointed he's not getting enough honors from Congress and from Washington, soon after that, he starts to communicate secretly with the British, and Peggy, who's madly in love with him, he's quite a bit older than she, cooperates, and she actually does pass a lot of papers and helps with, his attempted, revolution, or stopping the revolution, and helping, aiding and abetting the British. And eventually she's found out, and she, like Benedict Arnold, when he escapes to the British, and eventually in New York, which is occupied by the British, she is banished with her young baby finally, because she's found to be a spy. She's banished to New York, and then eventually, of course, after the revolution, they go to England.
Yeah.
So you have examples of the split in loyalties, and to this day, people don't know. I mean, there have been many journal articles and so on, and the family, for many years earlier on in the 19th century, defended her in all of their writings about her subsequent to her death, that she really was just an innocent young woman who just did what her husband wanted her to. But in any case, and we don't know, but in any case, it shows the difference between these two women, one who becomes, follows her husband desperately through these army camps and she lives at Valley Forge. Things weren't easy. And the other one, becomes, a willing, or maybe just a subservient, to her husband, spy.
Let me ask you that too, is the fact that it's like, like I said, once again, we go back to the same old adage of not knowing more because we don't get kind of really kind of in-depth documents. Is it with her, with Arnold, is there a sense that's at play here that she would have gone whichever way he would have gone? I mean, we're not talking about a Mata Hari. We're not a Mata Hari here. It isn't like I'm working with the British and I'm going to sway my husband. I want to make that really clear, that there is no, Lady Macbeth is not lurking in the shadows here, despite the way she's framed by some people at some points in history. She literally, if he'd have been like, nope, we're going to stick with the revolution, we're going to dance with who we brung, she would have gone right down the line with that too, correct? From what we know.
I agree with you. I mean, she was 18 when she married him. She was madly in love with him. As I say, he was a lot older than she. He was a glamorous figure. He was then still a war hero and revered for his bravery in earlier battles, including in Saratoga. And so, of course, she would go with, and that was, by the way, a woman's duty at that time, was to follow her husband. And by the way, I just circle back for a second to Mercy Otis Warren. Mercy Otis Warren's husband, strangely enough, historians still sort of wonder at it. Her husband, unlike most husbands, encouraged her to be outspoken and to write and to publish. That was very unusual. Women followed generally their husbands.
And the other thing about, and to kind of circle back to Peggy Shippen for a second here, it's also important to point out, a lot of people don't understand this because people just think of Arnold as a traitor. Up until the moment, what's the great point, that Arnold had a point up to the point where he actually betrayed the country. That he actually was absolutely right to some degree, that if I was in love with somebody and they were getting the short end of the stick the way that Arnold was with a lot of situations, I would have supported him right down the line. And it's important to point this out, that if I loved somebody and they were being treated the way that Benedict Arnold was being treated, not by Washington, but by people who were close to Washington, I might have been a little bit aggravated with the colonial army as well, too. Is that fair?
That's absolutely the truth. That's absolutely it. And, he was not made a full general. Younger people were, even though he'd been severely wounded, and he'd been led many battles. He even financed many of the troops. And as I say, he was instrumental, very important in the Battle of Saratoga and others. He was a war hero. And Washington, it wasn't Washington per se, but whatever Congress was broke. Congress had didn't pay a lot of their soldiers. Congress couldn't. That's why we sent Franklin and others over to Europe to get funds from the French and the Dutch. But anyway, so Congress was broke, but for whatever reason, whatever politics went on, Arnold was being delayed and being fully honored, and the best that Washington could do for him was to make him the commandant. He was the civil sort of governor of Philadelphia, which was still up in sort of chaos because the British had occupied it for 9 months. And all of a sudden, it's a whiplash. First, the British were running the show there, and then suddenly the revolutionaries and the rebels, the patriots, came back. So it was a very confusing time. And Arnold was to make peace among these citizens. Again, there's another example of the dissension between, should we go with the revolution or should we stay with the mother country? So, there it is right there. And that's why he came, and that's why he was a war hero. But by then he was so disenchanted that slowly, when things didn't happen and he never was repaid for all the money he spent taking care of troops and furnishing them and organizing them and bringing them and so on to these battles, never made a general until much later. And then it wasn't even announced. It was just told to him, almost, I don't know, in a letter or whatever. So there were a lot of reasons why and then, of course, he had made political enemies in Philadelphia on top of it all. So that's when he started, soon after they were married, to communicate secretly with the British. And, again, the things aren't always what they seem. It looks like, and some historians and some novels and movies have made Peggy into this evil seductress who, during their honeymoon, convinced and changed Arnold's mind. That's not true.
It's not true. It's not true.
No.
I know a really good author who's written about this at length, by the way, who actually makes a really good argument for the counterpoint. Oh, she's with us right now, and I'm thrilled to have Nancy Rubin Stuart here. As a matter of fact, it's a great example, though. This is what's really important to remember: that contextualizing Peggy, Shippen, Arnold is so important. Look, I'm never going to be an 18-year-old woman madly in love with a British with an American colonial general. That being said, it is not a hard empathetic leap. We've all loved somebody desperately, and when we've watched them getting the short end of the stick, there's almost nothing we wouldn't do for somebody we cared about that much to make sure that they got the life that they deserve. And that's made really, really clear. On the flip side of this, like we'll go back to Mercy Otis Warren again, and there is evidence, you've suggested it, other people have, that he really empowered her. And by the way, I don't want that to sound like, oh, what a great thing for him to do. But it really was, to some degree, courageous, because the number of people who would go to people when a man had an outspoken wife in those days, it would be like, hey, can you control your wife? Nope, and you shouldn't do it either. You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's something that plays through here, that a man who was willing to stand up for his wife and say, don't talk to my wife that way, and she can have her own mind, that is somebody who is a kind of a miracle of the times, correct?
Absolutely. And, again, people, historians and other writers have just kind of wondered at this man who did that. He just seemed to be, and if you see his portrait, which was done by Copley, as was Mercy Warren's, they are both in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. He looks like first of all, he is the sheriff of Plymouth, so no easy job. This is not an easy person, highly thought of and brilliant. But of course, we also have to remember that her plays in the beginning were not bylined. Nobody knew who they were. So it was only a few friends and the Sons of Liberty and Adams, both Adams, Sam and John, and a few others, Abigail, a few other people knew that she was writing these things as a secret. So, that's why the book is actually called The Muse of the Revolution, The Secret Pen of Mercy Warren and the Founding of a Nation, because it was secret. Even as late as 1814, her name, there was no copyright. So other people put their name on these pamphlets and newspaper articles to get credit for them. The Boston Athenaeum had somebody else's name on her most important play. And shortly before her death, Mercy asked John, they finally made up, John Adams, would he please go to Boston and please go to the Athenaeum and please correct that plagiarism on there. They didn't use the word in those days. It's pre-copyright. So again, it was kept kind of quiet. That it wasn't until much later, although people certainly after the Revolution, after a while, because she spoke out and she demanded a Bill of Rights, by the way, after the Constitution, again, not with her byline. But soon afterwards, she finally published some things in her own name. And so by now, then people start to know. But it's after the revolution, it's quite a ways later. So, they knew her as, quotes, the formidable Mrs. Warren. But again, as you mentioned, and it certainly has been said, highly unusual that her husband had supported her all those years to be able to do these writings.
NancyRubinStuart.com, by the way. But Nancy joins us this morning here on Revolution Road with the Journal of the American Revolution. You can find her on the Book of Face at Nancy Rubin Stuart. Same place over on LinkedIn. I'm going to find you on LinkedIn. And by the way, if you go to NancyRubinStuart.com, you're going to see all the marvelous books that she has a byline for. And we're thrilled to have her here this morning. Guys, please check out Poor Richard's Women, Defiant Brides, The Muse of the Revolution, and the national bestseller, American Empress. Nancy, you're welcome back anytime. It's good to have you. Thank you so much for your insight. And like I said, we need more women on Portrait with Shotguns telling men to stop doing stupid things. Thank you, Nancy.
My pleasure. Take care.
All right.